Shalom, WJC family. It's time for our weekly Torah Talk. This week in Shul, we will be reading Parshat Ki Tetze. We're deep in the heart of Moshe's speech to the people before they enter the Promised Land. And he is giving them a legal code, right? Rules by which to live so that they will be successful, have a successful society, a holy society in the land that God has promised them. In chapter 22, we read one of these very interesting legal passages. It's the rules for returning lost objects. And we read, "You shall not see the ox of your brother or his sheep or a goat cast off, and hide yourself from them." Right? V'hit alamta mehem. Hide yourself from them. So you can't ignore these things. You shall surely return them to your fellow. Then, in verse 3, it tells you more things you need to return, and it concludes with you should do this with anything from your fellow that's become lost and you find it. And again, lo tuchal lihitalem. You shall not hide yourself. But this time it doesn't say from the objects. And so the rabbis hear this and they interpret it. They said, the real problem here isn't the returning of lost objects. It's hiding yourself. What does it mean to hide yourself? It means to ignore what's going on out there. Oh, there's a wandering donkey, not my problem. Oh, there's a person who's lost his stuff, not my problem. This not my problem attitude, lihit alem, to hide ourselves, this is a rampant problem in the world around us. I mean, how often do we go through our lives with our heads down, just trying not to let anything, invade our personal perspective? I spoke about an article that David Brooks published on August 25th in the New York Times, where he spoke about studies that show people get on a train, they put in their earbuds and ignore everyone around them. They hope no one invades their space, but studies show that, in fact, happiness will come from connecting with other people. We think that we will hate the conversation, that it'll annoy us and take away from our happiness. In fact, when we engage with others and let them in, it actually makes us happier. Here we seem to be talking about a similar idea. We're closing ourselves off to the world around us. Why? We think it's not my problem. I don't have to deal with that. But the rabbis recognize this. The Talmud sees this idea that we might ignore things around us, and that when we ignore objects, what we're really doing is ignoring people. And it's interesting, in talking about our passages in Bava Metzia, very famous Talmud, some of the first Talmud that is taught usually to first-time Talmud students in yeshiva, it says, you have to return these lost objects, but a Torah scholar, for their honor, if it's going to be embarrassing, if it's something gross or beneath them, then they don't have to return the object. There's an exemption from returning the object, not because they should ignore the people in need, but because it might diminish the dignity of Torah and these representatives of Torah. Fine, we could like that, we cannot like that. What's very interesting is later, in a comment on Isaiah 58:7, we get the same language as regards to your relatives. Right? We're told, lo titalem. Same language, right? Titalem, right? You shall surely not ignore your flesh, right? So when the rabbis are interpreting this, when it comes to people, when it comes to your relatives, there's no exemption mentioned for a Torah scholar. Even a Torah scholar, even if it might be undignified, when it comes to ignoring relatives, not allowed. Oh, so you might say, fine, it's your relatives. I get it. It's not the same thing. But I think what the rabbis are really getting at in both cases is, unless it's really a problem for you for some reason, you can't do it, or it's beneath your dignity to do it, that you can't ignore people. You can't ignore the consequences of people if you see them suffering for one reason or another, suffering loss of an object or suffering humiliation, that there's really no excuse not to help. Al titalem. You shouldn't ignore, you shouldn't hide yourself. But why? If it's going to cost me, okay, so we should be nice. But can the legal code actually say it's the law to be nice? It doesn't seem to make sense. So usually if there is such a law in the Torah, it is for our own good in one way or another, right? Much like those folks on the train in the research studies that David Brooks mentions, our instinct is to ignore, to close ourselves off from those around us, but the expense is our happiness. So this reminded me of a story in Kitchen Table Wisdom by the psychiatrist Rachel Naomi Remen. Wonderful, wonderful stories, great wisdom included here. She talks about flying on a plane. And there's a gentleman next to her. He spills his food. There was like a yogurt cup given to them, and he spills it. And she looks in, and he kind of gasps, and she looks. They hadn't made any contact. They hadn't talked. She got on the plane, took out a book, stuck it right up to her face so that contact wouldn't be made. When the food came, she put it away. He gasps, and she sees he's dropped his stuff. And the yogurt fell, and it fell on his right foot, which he is now kind of not moved to clean up or wipe off, but just has slid it under his chair. When she kind of looks closer, she realizes his left leg is in a brace and it's clearly paralyzed. So there's really nothing he can do about it. So she feels bad, so she clicks, the call button. Nobody comes. Finally, a flight attendant comes around with the drink cart, and she says, "Hey, can we get a wet towel? Look what's happened here." And the flight attendant snaps at her. Like, what do you mean? I've got 450 people on this plane, and I've got to take care of all of them. And what can I possibly do for you? Like, you're just going to have to wait. And she and her neighbor in the plane look at each other, a little surprised by the outburst, an obviously overwhelmed, overworked flight attendant. And she realizes that it had not occurred to the flight attendant that she wanted to be involved in this solution. And so she said very softly, if you can just bring me a wet towel, I'll clean up the mess. The flight attendant looked a little taken aback by this, but she kind of turned on her heel and stomped off and got the wet towel, brought it back, handed it to her, went on her way without a word. Rachel Naomi kind of connects with the man. Turns out they both have disabilities. She understands, and finally, he kind of allows her to clean up, and they've connected, and it was just a very nice moment. But here's what was really amazing. As she's getting up to leave, two flight attendants come by as the plane's getting ready to land and thank her for helping out and for her kindness. Then, as she's going to leave, another flight attendant comes up to her and says, "Oh, thank you so much for helping out. That was really nice." Then when she's leaving, she goes to give the captains, "Thank you, bye, goodbye." She goes to give the nod. And he stops her and shakes her hand and says, "Thank you so much for your act of kindness. Thank you so much for helping out," right? Word had spread from the flight attendants to the captain that there was this kind, nice person on the plane who acknowledged the suffering of someone else, who didn't ignore, and he pressed something into her hands. And when she was halfway up the jetway, she looked, and they'd given her, these airplane wings that they give to children as a little toy. It was all he could give to thank her for her kindness. But what she says, and I'll quote her here because it's profound. She says, "This is a flight crew. A flight crew deals with hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. Their surprise reaction to a simple act of kindness is chilling. Perhaps we are no longer a kind people. More and more we seem to have become numb to the suffering of others and ashamed of our own suffering. Yet suffering is one of the universal conditions of being alive," she says. "We all suffer. We have become terribly vulnerable, not because we suffer, but because we have separated ourselves from each other. And she writes this years ago. I would say we've only fallen deeper into this trap. And here's how she concludes the essay about the plane ride. Just profound and important, and I think perhaps why the rabbis find this so important, not to ignore others, not for their sake, but for her own, for our own. She says, a patient once told me that he tried to ignore his own suffering and the suffering of other people because he wanted to be happy. Yet becoming numb to suffering will not make us happy. The part in us that feels suffering is the same as the part that feels joy. The part in us that feels suffering is the same as the part in us that feels joy. If we shut off, if we turn inward, if we ignore others, it's not their happiness we ultimately sacrifice. It's ours. And Moses is telling the people, and the Torah is telling us, we need to open up. We need to reach out. Not only will we live in a nicer place and a nicer community and a nicer world, but we ultimately will find ourselves to be happier people. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. I wish you a Shabbat and an Elul season, a season of tshuva, not only of inward looking, but also of outward reaching. And I wish us all the kind of joy that Rachel Naomi Riemann talks about, and that we all seek, a joy of connection, a joy of that may include suffering, but ultimately the shared moment, the sharing of each other's suffering, the lifting of each other up, that will lead to more happiness in the world, including our own. Shabbat Shalom.